I'm Laura. I'm the Collective Conventions Project Manager and a librarian at the University of Delaware.
I'm Michelle Burns. I'm an InfoSci undergrad at Penn State, and I co-chair the exhibits committee.
I'm Katie Rawson. I'm the Director of Learning Innovation here at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, and I have been doing the Colored Conventions project in little drips and drabs for years now.
Hi, I'm Shannon Williams. I'm an assistant professor of history at Villanova University, writing a book on Black Catholic nuns in the United States. Happy to be here.
My name is Stuart Varner. I'm the managing director of the Price Lab for Digital Canon, so welcome.
I'm Arlene Wilson. I am a PhD candidate in the English department at University of Delaware and a CCP member.
Kevin Winstead. I'm a postdoc fellow at CCP, and also producing today.
I undergrad at Penn State, and I co-chair the exhibits committee.
Director of Learning Wilson.
And she records us. Oh, sorry. All right, so I think we're ready to go?
Yep.
Are we live?
Yep.
All right, so welcome.
It'll come back.
So welcome everybody to the second installment of the Dig Black workshop series, Digital Tools and Methods for Black Research, held here at the Price Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. This series is to help explore methods for creating, curating, and sharing data in pursuit of racial and social justice. Today, Katie Rawson will present on data curation and publishing.
Yeah. So, some of the things that I'm going to talk about will sound familiar because we talked about them last time. And so we won't spend a long time on them, but there are things that, so last time we talked about data modeling and data sets, and so we'll touch on some of that stuff, but because we might have new folks, I'll make sure to explain what it is. In theory, I feel like if y'all walk out of here able to say like what data curation it is, how it differs from data publishing, and what data publishing is, what's in stages and considerations of data curation are, what a data dictionary is and why you might want to have one, and what some key questions for data curation are. Like, I feel like that that will be good. I make that list because last time was super conversational. This time I have a lot more slides, but they're somewhat recursive. So you'll notice that I'll talk about some of these things and then we'll leave them and then we'll talk about them again. So just a sense of like things to look out for. Also, I feel like all things like this are better when one is interrupted by people and when it's actually a conversation. So we'll have a few points where we actually stop and delve into stuff in conversation, but in general, if I say something and you're like, wait, what? Or you're like, oh, that sounds like this thing, I want to talk about this, then we should talk about it. Also, my name is on this slide, not because I feel any ownership over the material, but just because, like, if you want to talk to me more about the things we talk about today, you should know who I am. But I am hoping that it won't just be me talking at you. Can I actually do this? There we go. So, to begin with, what do we mean by data curation? So, some of you may have seen this before. I know that Kevin's seen it because he's actually seen this literal slide before. So this is one version of what data curation is. It's a fairly complicated life cycle, and I think that it's important to keep in mind that, like, in some ways, even though this is a terrible graphic, it is also true that data curation is actually like this complex, has this many moving parts. The parts where arrows seem to like come back and do the same thing in recursive ways. Like that is actually a terrible representation of what it is like. But instead of trying to understand this particular visualization, I want to give us an easier text-based definition. So data curation is the active and ongoing management of data throughout its entire life cycle of interest and usefulness to scholarship. So the key pieces of this are that it is active and ongoing management, that it's active and ongoing management of data, and then I think that it's also important that the idea is that it's as long as things are of interest and usefulness for scholarship, right? That there is actually a kind of like value claim in this statement that I think is important for the work that the CCP is doing and for the work that scholars do in general, is to think about the value that they are adding to things. So this will be familiar to people who came last time. So this is a definition of data, just really quickly to refresh us on when we talk about data, what are we talking about? So Sabina Leonelli says, I propose to view data as any product of research activities ranging from artifacts such as photographs to symbols such as letters or numbers, which is collected, stored, and disseminated in order to be used as evidence for knowledge claims. So again, the key pieces of this are that it's a product of research activities, that you have to be able to collect it, and that you're going to use it as evidence. And her definition goes on there. Hence, any object can be considered as a datum as long as 1, it is treated as potential evidence for one or more claims about phenomena, and 2, it's possible to circulate it among individuals. And this circulating among individuals is a key piece of why we care about data curation and data publishing, right? That on the one hand, you clearly, if you're a lone scholar and you're never going to let anyone see your data, like you can still want to curate it well, but if you want to publish it, like that is key to the circulation of it. So the other piece of this, which we're going to spend most of our time on, is the notion of active and ongoing management. So what data curation really is it is about coming up with systems and working with sets of decisions that allow us to not just do our work and have things fall as they may, but really taking an active and engaged role in managing what's happening with our data. In the world of scholarly data, there are usually two kinds of management. And I think that this is an interesting place to talk about a third piece that is important for this particular set of workshops about Black research, and particularly about the CCP. So generally, either the researcher is doing the management, right? Like you are collecting your own data, you are figuring out what formats it should be in, you are figuring out your data model, you are backing it up, and making sure that when your computer gets dropped in water, you still have your data. There's also institutional management. So when you work with the library and they back up your data, or that institutional management is also sometimes that you are part of some kind of consortium, and everybody in this consortium uses a particular code book that you all believe in labeling your data in particular kinds of ways. So if we think about astronomers who are like a lovely case study in people who are really good at data curation and data sharing, they also have lots and lots of shared standards that they all agree to. That's generally not the case in the humanities at all, in part for some of the reasons that we talked about last time, which is that humanities data is often deeply idiosyncratic on purpose because it is what people care about. So the third piece in the middle here that isn't discussed normally is a notion of community management. or collective management. So the idea that you wouldn't have a sole researcher making these decisions and using the data, and it wouldn't also be like an institutional mandate necessarily, or institutional structures that you're working in, but that a group of people might need to collectively together figure out their data management process, which I think in some ways makes it harder because it is not the norm, right? And so it will mean lots of discussions, which I know that y'all are very used to, about like how are you going to agree to what you are doing. And so institutions will often be like, it has to be in format X. If you're a lone researcher, no one cares if you choose format Y. But if you are a collective, then it doesn't have to be in format X. And you don't get to just choose whether it's format Y. And so I think that some of the questions that we'll answer later might help us think about how does one do this as collective decision making. Okay. So this is a terrible slide. No one should ever make a slide that looks like this, but look, I did. So basically, data curation is trying to answer these questions with a yes, right? These are yes/no questions. The goal of good data curation is that we get to say yes to all of them. So the things that we're trying to consider when we're doing our data curation is, can we analyze this data set in the ways that we want to analyze it? Can we use it with the technologies of tomorrow, or can we get it out of the technologies of yesterday? So the first question is really about analysis and manipulation. The second question is really about preservation. The third question is, can we find it? And that, on the one hand, might seem like an easy question if you have like one spreadsheet and it's on your hard drive, but gets more and more complex if you have distributed where your data is over time, if you have shared it with other people, right? Like there are lots of places that your data can end up that you might manage to lose it. Can we figure out what it represents? So if someone comes upon your data set, whether that's someone be you in 5 years, or whether it is someone else, do they know what, when you say South Carolina in this column, do they know what that's actually referring to? Like if you say that something is someone's like death place, do people know, like, is that their reported death place? Is that what a particular document said, right? Like, where is this coming from? Will people be able to do their own interpretation based on the data and what they should know about it, right? And I think especially with historical data, that's like super important, because in fact, the like provenance and integrity of the data is in knowing where it comes from, what it actually means. Second to last, can we cite it? So, like, will people be able to, when they use this data, know how to say that they got it, and know how to say whose data it is? And then the last piece, can you share it? Can you actually give it to someone else to use? And your answer might be, no, I can't give it to someone else to use because I don't want to. And that's fair. That is like a fair answer. It's just a question that if that is your answer, then you need to be like, yes, this is why I can't share it, because it shouldn't be shared. So I think that it is important to have a few negative definitions. So data curation is not preservation. So preservation, in this little Death Star graphic, preservation is just one little piece of what data curation is. And so we're going to go through lots of the other pieces of it. It is also not publishing. So there are big pieces of publishing that have nothing to do with data curation, And there are big pieces of data curation that have nothing to do with publishing. And then there's this piece of data publishing where they actually intersect. So I'm going to pause here, and this is one of these moments where I'm like, this is why you need to know all the things we're doing. So we're going to come back to data curation in a minute. But first I want to talk about when someone uses the term data publishing, what do they mean? So in general, when people talk about publishing data, they don't mean that you are just viewing it. That is generally considered just like scholarly publication, right? Like that is publishing. That's like publishing the interpretation. It's publishing the analysis. And even if you're publishing the analysis with pieces of the data that people can look at, that's the same thing as like publishing an article with an image of the primary source, right? Like the idea is that you're giving people a piece of the data so that they can follow your argument instead of giving them the data so they can do something with it. There's this like weird middle section that especially happens with digital data, which is around publishing things where people are manipulating the data themselves, right? Where someone actually like do something to change and understand different kinds of interpretations. But they don't always, in this case, they don't usually get to choose what the variables are. They just get to manipulate things in a way where you've already guided their questioning. And I'll show an example of that in a second. And then the thing that people really mean when they say data publication is generally like having it in a form that other people can reuse and can use for purposes that are different from the original purpose that someone put it together. Or so that in the sciences, it's often to like run the same thing twice, right, to like check people's work. Okay. So this is an example of how we might think about publishing analysis that is based on data. So this is just a snapshot that's from Separados. Is that the total name of it? Yeah. Which is this digital ICE project, and you can go through and you can look at all
anti-ICE.
Yes, digital anti-ICE. Yes, that's right. And you can go through and you can look at tons of data that they then contextualize for you, and you can look at it piece by piece without a ton of context. Like in some ways, this is like really looking at the raw data, but you can't then take this data and make your own map. Right? Like you can't do anything else with the data in this format. You can just understand what they are trying to help you understand, which is around whether people are Democrats or Republicans, and like how much money they are receiving through these centers. So in the case of manipulating, I should have written down the names of each of these projects. So this is a really creepy project where you put in an address and learn what would happen to people if a nuclear weapon of a particular type was to be detonated in a particular spot. So it works with population information as well as a ton of information about the effects of nuclear weapons. And so you can see that you can actually change things about the data. Like they give you access to saying like, what kind of bomb are you interested in learning about? You also get to put in whatever location you want to put in. But you can't actually, again, you can't actually take the data back, right? Like you can't manipulate it in any way other than the frames that they have already given you. So while you can change what you see and learn more and come to your own conclusions based on the things that you learn, they're already in an analytical framework. So you don't get access to the data. So reusing is basically that you get access to the data as it is, like that someone has curated this data and then they're going to publish it, and you can take it away and you can run whatever analysis you want on it. You can put it in whatever kinds of forms that you want. So this is from a project called Data Refuge that was collecting data sets that are actually federal data sets that are climate data sets because, we live in the world we live in, where we are trying to build these data sets. Okay, so that is a quick version of data publishing. We'll talk more about practices of data publishing and like what some of the key questions around that are later on. But I just wanted to say that this is how data publishing is different from data curation and also different from other kinds of scholarly publishing. Okay. So the next thing I want us to go through are thinking about in data curation. So what are pieces of the process? And this is not all of them, as y'all can see from that first visualization that I showed, where children. But this is one way to think through what data curation is. So there's a moment when we create data, there's a moment when we process data, there's a moment of analysis, there's a moment where we're doing preservation, and either giving access or reusing. So again, I know that we just talked about these questions, but I wanted to remind you of them. So the questions, as we're thinking about data curation again, are about analysis, preservation, being able to find things, understanding what it represents, knowing how to cite it, knowing how to share it. And when we think about how we're going to answer these questions, the real keys come back to our data model. So if you have a clear data model, then you can organize things in a way so that people can figure out what it represents, right? Because you yourself have thought about what it represents. Our actual data organization and definition. So by that, I mean, is this in spreadsheet? Have you chosen another kind of database for this? And have you defined what all of your columns mean? Do you know what these different pieces of data are? Chosen formats. So again, in some ways these have overlap. So the chosen formats are probably basically, is your data just a collection of things that people can look through, like boxes in an archive, right? One can imagine a world of digital boxes in an archive, like you just have a bunch of folders. People can go through them. In some ways, it's format agnostic. It's a data set that really is a data set that is structured by whatever you have decided to structure the folders by. That kind of data set might be really excellent for being able to analyze things in the way that you want. Or it might be really terrible, right? Like you might not be able to run a mapping process over data that's just sitting in a bunch of different things. So the question is, how do you actually want to analyze it, and have you set things up? Other formats that you might think about are, do we have everything in Excel sheets, or do we have everything in Airtable files, or do we have everything in CSVs? This is actually a really important thing to think through, even though as a human interacting with each of these objects might be they're just tables, right? And they are just tables, and there are even tables where you can move between those three kinds of objects, probably pretty quickly. Export functions are kind of amazing, right? You can turn things into other things. But if you give someone who doesn't have access to Airtable, your Airtable tables, then you don't have it anymore. if Airtable shuts down and you don't have things in CSVs, you don't have any.
Google Fusion.
Or, yes, yep, that's right. And so in thinking about format, the question really is, like, do you want to keep things in more than one format, actually? And what formats do you need to keep it for? And you might want to think about one format for preservation and one format for analysis, right? You might realize that, like, oh, in order to analyze this the way that I want to, I should have it in an Excel file. But in order to have it when something, I want it in CSV, which are comma-separated values. It's just like a format of. Okay, and then finally our chosen platforms, which again, the Airtable and Fusion discussion, which we'll get back to. So I wanted to give y'all one example of a project where I think their approach to data curation is quite laudable and is really helpful for understanding what different pieces of data curation might be. So there's a project out of UCLA that started as a course project, but then has continued to grow. That's called Early African American Film, and it is reconstructing the history of silent race films, 1909 to 1930. So things that this project, I think, does well that are helpful is, at its heart, it was a project that was about making data that didn't already exist. So there were all these films and all these film companies, and no one had really aggregated this work. No one had made it clear who these people were, what their relationships were. It was basically a buried history. And so the goal of this group was to surface as much of the history as they could. And in the same way that last time we talked about how in the sciences and social sciences, these kinds of like null fields where you have gaps would be considered a real problem. This is another example where the gaps aren't a problem, right? The gaps are the place where they have not found the information that they need yet. Other things about the way that this data is created and processed that I think are really great is you can see that this first column here is just a column for the name of the company. The second column is a controlled vocabulary, right? If you had people not use a controlled vocabulary in this and told them that they just needed to mark whether something was white or African American owned, you could end up with probably 8 billion ways of specifying it. So they've done a good job of saying, we're just going to have 2 options, you're going to have to select from one of them. The dates, you'll notice that they have chosen a particular date format, which is day, month, year. It might not be the best format, right? Like there are lots of ways to do this, so they haven't chosen to put the zeros in, or at least in this visualization of it. But my guess is that they have, that they have actually specified that this is a date. And so the way that they've done it is that the system probably does recognize these things as dates and sorts them as a data type that is dates. You can also do this in Excel, right? Like you can do this in lots of places. This is something that a CSV, a comma-separated values file, might not take with it, right? So when we think about what proprietary formats allow us to do and what they don't allow us to do. So proprietary formats sometimes allow us to add extra information underneath the layer of information that we see. So even though these dates are formatted in this particular way, my understanding, at least based on what I've seen them do with this data, is that it's actually been specified as date data, so that it understands that this isn't just a string that is 1/1, but it understands like January comes before February, February comes before March, and that this number is a date, and that the first of the month comes before the 6th of the month, but that 2/1 comes after 1/31, right? Which would not be intuitive to a computer, right? Like maybe it would know that, but maybe it wouldn't. The third piece of this, where one can see things go a little more off the like good data formatting rails, but not too far off the rails, right? So I would argue that maybe 3 bad habits are happening here, right? So one is we've got our 2 little Atlanta Georgias that are different Georgias. Also, if you cannot have commas in your cells, if you can separate out your state cells from your city cells, it's usually the best place. And then also, some of these have street addresses as well as city states, right? Yes, that is the right response. Which is like, oh God, nothing's gonna work. And then the last piece is that they have all of the films that these different companies have produced. And one of the things I find interesting about how we know that this is a data set that is being put together from a bunch of different sources is that you'll notice that for 2 of these that they know are these kinds of film companies, they don't have any films. Like they don't actually know what films the companies produce. Whereas for the Apollo, they understand that this is a film company that they should know something about. They understand that they like made this movie called Love Me, Love My Dog. But they don't actually know what any other kinds of information about. The other thing in this slide that you might be able to see is that they have in the back a definition of what they're talking about, right? So they contextualize everything with these kinds of explanatory materials that let you know, like, when we say a race film, what do we mean? The other reason that I think that this is kind of a, well, maybe you can go back here really. So this is their data in Airtable that they were making and manipulating. And then if you go to the site, there is also their visualizations that they have made, and some of those visualizations are made in yet another tool called Plotly, and some of those visualizations are made in another tool called Cytoscape. So they're taking the same data and they're using it in a bunch of different tools, but the data is still staying in the same formats, and they're just like moving it into the tool they need to move it. Lovely? I don't know. Anyway, in a way that I adore. They have this section that is use, modify, or cite this data. And there are a few things that are helpful to think through that I know that the CCP has also thought through, which is they tell you what kinds of licensing they're using. So they have a CC BY license, which basically means anyone can use this, but you have to say who it's from. They tell you how you can download the data set. So you can do it through Airtable, or you can also go to Zenodo Data Repositories, which we'll talk about in a minute. It is like a data repository where they have a stable copy of it. The stable copy of it is in, I believe, a CSV format. They also, I think this is really sweet, they give you a collection of tutorials that shows you how to make the things that they make. And then they have a way to cite their data. And this part, again, is like the pieces of this are like the data publication part of this, that they have chosen to publish their data in a way for reuse. Okay, so going through the pieces of the life cycle, and lots of this will now be review because we kind of talked about it with our example. In general, when we think about managing for ongoing use, the first question is, when you are creating it, how are you going to put it in, right? So thinking about, like, are you going to use a spreadsheet? Are you going to use a database? What different ways do you want to do that? Like, where do you want people to listen to? Which I feel like from our conversation a couple of weeks ago for the CCP is not a single answer. Right, like that some of your materials are in kind of interesting website-based databases, like Omeka, which is it is a kind of database. It is not like an access database, right? But it is a kind of base of data that is collected in a way that is like based on a computer system, and you can export it in formats like JSON or, right? And then you also clearly do have like good old spreadsheets. As you continue to create data, I think the real question is what do you want it to, what formats do you want it to be? And part of the question here is what formats will allow you to analyze things in the way that you want to analyze them? What forms will allow other people to take them? What forms will allow you to future-proof the content? And for people who are not working on the CCP project, like, if you're starting now, if you get to start from scratch, it's always better to like begin by thinking through what is your data model and then like what do you want your data set to have. So the next piece is really defining the data form. And so this goes back to the model that we were talking about last time, which is that like you really do want to have a model of how your data is connected to each other. What are your attributes and what are your entities and what is the relationship between the attributes and entities in your model? Even if one of those attributes is like a picture of something, right? These things don't necessarily have to be all text or numbers or anything like that. Like they can actually be films or images, but you still have to be like, this image is connected to this entity that is a person in this way, or is connected to this newspaper that is one of my entities in this way. And then the last piece, which kind of goes to that, is like making connections. So that as you build your data from the beginning, you want to be like, this is how one piece of data is connected to the other. So in thinking about processing is basically the moment where you realize that you have dirty data and you need to do it, right? Except that, as we talked about last time, is that you do want to have standard formats, even if you want to attend to incompleteness and textures and outliers. Even if you want to record uncertainty, you have to record uncertainty in the same way every time. So the idea isn't that things need to fit a universal standard, but that you have to have a standard that you have chosen. The tool to help you do this is Google Refine. You can talk more about that later if you want. And I wanted to talk about this key practice, which I think, especially with a large project that has lots of different data sources in the data set, that a data dictionary is something that you just have to have. So, I am going I'm going to talk about work that I have done just because, like, I think that it gives you a sense of what it might look like to build a data dictionary. So, a data dictionary does a few things. First of all, it tells you something about the data. Right, like it describes, like, what is happening here, how can you get the data. So you'll notice that in this case, we tell you, you can get the data here. This is what you would do, like you click on this link, label this, and then these are the things that you will get back. So you'll get a zip file. Your zip file will have the following things in it. Even if you're not working with published data, I can imagine a version of this for the CCP that would say, the data files are available in, and then they would list the Omeka site, and then they would list wherever the spreadsheet A lives, right? That there would be a way that you would be able to tell people, like, this is where our data is. And then ours also tells you, like, how you might want to open it. Which is that it doesn't, when you are describing what is in your data set, it doesn't all have to be in a single sheet. But if you have more than one sheet of connected data, you have to tell people every single little piece of it is. If what you have is a CSV, and then you have a folder that has 600 videos in it, you need to tell them one of these things is a CSV file. This is what's in the CSV file. One of these things is a folder with 600 videos. This is what the 600 videos are. One of the nice things about this is that you can continue to expand your data dictionary, but it means that everybody that's part of the project will be able to go somewhere and at one glance be like, this is everything we own. And this is like what it is in kind of a layperson's words. Also, I think this is like kind of a fun and terrible group activity if there are a bunch of you working on a project to be like, what do we think the menu item CSV is? Like, what is that representing? So, then we tell you the conventions that are used within the data, what happens when there are missing data points, right? Like how we're going to approach that. And in this case, we did not make the data ourselves. We inherited it. We actually were just reusing it from someone else. And so our claim is like, yeah, some people did things in different ways. These are the different ways that they did them. Like, we're not gonna, like, we're not remediating this data, or we're just gonna tell you what's wrong with it. Yeah.
you may be getting to this. So if you are, then I don't want to sidetrack us. But what do we do if we want community people to be able to understand our language and download and use our data?
Yeah.
And what would this look like if it were translated into something for a Black Genealogical Society where there are people of all kinds of different data literacies coming to and bringing all kinds of different strengths to something like this. And then we're thinking about making sure that this is behind not a paywall, but a protection wall, which means that we're thinking about going to get people, scholars, to create videos that say, before you download any of our data, we need you to look at one of these 4 videos, and we're going to have Dinah Rainey Berry talking about why naming people is actually important, about the dangers of big data, about the ways in which conventional ways of lexicons and keywords like management, when you put management and Black together in North America, you've got all kinds of, embers that just like fly off into fires, right? So we want people to start thinking through that and coming up with some MOUs, and they've got to actually listen to some things before they get to our data. How do we how does that change this kind of conversation?
So I think that the gateway doesn't actually change this conversation. I think that this is something that any group that is sharing data needs to do, even if that data is like incredibly sensitive and you would never share it with anyone other than one other person that is working on the project, or if it is just for yourself. I think that making a dictionary that includes what are the pieces of my data and actually articulates that, and like what do these pieces mean? If there are rows and columns, what do my rows and columns mean? Where did this data come from? Like I think that makes work that just always has to be done. I think the wording question is quite a different question, and I think that all of this same information could use completely different words. And I think you wouldn't even have to change the categories, right? That there would be a section that would be like, what information do we have, right? And then would say, there is this kind of file, it does this, or is even, it could be even more accessible than that, right? Like you could even move away from describing file type at all and just say, if you click here, you will get the following things. You can use them in this particular tool. The other thing you can do, I think that it kind of depends on what you want different people in the community to do. So I think about the difference between giving people access to, so there's a moment where you have people help you create data, right, where you're giving them rights back so that they can actually write to whatever you are doing. In which case you do actually have to take the time to say, like, this is a column. This is what this column does. Because otherwise they won't be able to be like empowered members of the community that is making this data. It seems like that would be a kind of barrier that would make it so that people would be like, I just don't feel comfortable putting things into a spreadsheet like this. Then I think that there are other ways to separate the front end of data collection from the back end of data management, which I think is a lot of what data curation is. So good data curation doesn't mean that people see that your data is complex and scary. It actually means that people can interact with your data in the way that you want them to, and that they don't ever have to be confused.
So how do we talk about that in these workshops so that we can make that, I'm thinking sort of like, what makes a workshop a Black data workshop?
Yeah.
Right, and what are the questions that emerge from Black data collections that allow us to talk about the interventions as well as the mastery, right?
Yeah.
Or the, or the familiarity. So obviously we want to know what data curation is, what data public publishing is, what a data dictionary is, but what about a workshop infuses questions about Black data curation into the question? You may be going there.
Yeah.
But how do we think through who are we curating this for?
Yeah.
What are the values and the ethics that are embedded in this? Who is our audience? Like,
Yes.
I love when you show the, as the example, and I was groaning too, because I've been around Anna enough to, like groan when you've got states and addresses and stuff together, right? You're appropriately and fabulously cranky in all the right ways that make it in all the right ways. That was not a critique. That was appreciation and love. But there was that moment where they go, is it white owned or is it Black owned? And I always love the kind of explicit nature of those kinds of questions. So it's like, what is this? What makes a workshop a Black data workshop, right? What are those questions? What are those interventions?
Yeah.
How do we think through that together and collectively here? And Shannon, I also realized we skipped that first moment where we go, what do we want to get out of the workshop and what brought you here? And so if it's okay, Katie, we should all be doing this. We shouldn't just put you on but we're sort of a collective. And that's the question I sort of want to, always want to get at is like, what makes a data workshop Black? What makes the data interventions Black? I'm interested so that we can make those kind of interventions. And Shannon, what do you want to get out here, if we may ask, if that's okay?
Absolutely. So I'm writing my first book, the contract with University Press, and the past 13 years now, I've been collecting all of the signatures of Black Africans. But I have sort of a massive data set where so much of that information is just not going to go into the book. So, for example, the names of all the Black secretaries, actually the names of all the Black sisters that we know in the United States, because there haven't been that many, it's something that we can actually sort of get a hold to, especially those who are members of the historically Black sisterhood. So where can I put all of this information that I have in terms of the visuals, in terms of the names, in terms of the names of their schools? Is it something that I want to do in terms of like creating sort of a digital map so we can see where all the Black Catholic schools were in the nation and give all this information, because quite frankly, so much of this information is just simply not accessible to the vast majority of people. Mm-hmm. And so for me, my goal is, how do I get all this information out there that can't go into 110 page, 10-word book, right? But that will be meaningful not only to academics, those who are teaching Black religion, those who are teaching the Black Catholic experience, but also to this larger Black Catholic community that people don't realize exists in the United States, who know this information, and quite frankly, whose history has been erased.
So you wanted to go to them too?
Yes, I mean, quite frankly, they're my primary audience.
Okay, that's the real question, right? Like, who is that audience?
Right.
And then if we went even further than that, are you concerned about the ways that data might be used? Is there a community of concern? Are there people who in the middle of the night you wake up, you go, I publish my data, and these get my hands on my data. Excuse my language.
It's our string.
I ate it. So like then I will be slightly worried about what they could do to it. What are the data limits? What are the limits that you want to also put around it?
Well, what's interesting is, so I've done over 100 oral history interviews with current and former sisters, also both the students of those who were educated by Black nuns, also with other white sisters too, who were in communities that were desegregated by Black nuns. And that project is actually just going to be an oral history project. So that's where my most sensitive data is in the oral history interviews. But I feel like I'll have my handle on that. I do not want that individual project.
So you're not going to tag that stuff?
It won't be tagged. Certainly not in the foreseeable future. Maybe something along the lines, because part of that too is I want those interviews, ones that I can share, to go to an archive, to the more traditional archive, to go to Marquette, which is where a lot of the material is. So beyond that though, so much of this information for me, and my strategy in getting sort of the idea is, we know that historians of the Black experience, and what we've always understood is that one of the greatest weapons of white supremacy has been to erase the history of violence and history. And so one of the most radical things that we can do is to tell that story. And so part of this, for me, with this project will be, here is, for people who have never seen Black nuns, who will tell you there are no such things as Black nuns, the most powerful thing that I can do is to give you that image and say, these are what and here's everything that we know. And so, again, I'm sort of new to this too, so I don't actually know some of a lot of the questions that I should be asking in digital work as well. So I'm actually just here to learn and sort of figure out, now that the book is almost away from me, what do I do with the rest of the information? Because I'm going to be with it forever.
Yeah. And Katie, I'm so sorry we didn't do this at the beginning. We leave any sort of workshop person who's in the front at a disadvantage by not setting up like, oh, we're here to get this out of.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else in the room who wants to say a little bit about what they are hoping to get? And now that you know a little bit about Katie's expertise and ability to lay things out plainly and legibly, what you might want to get out of the workshop too. And then if anybody wants to tweet out who's live streaming what you might want to get out to, we can include that as well. We can sort of go to Twitter if there's anything that you would like included. Anybody else?
I was mentioning to Katie beforehand that this will be useful for me to sort of zoom out of the CCP world and look at all the materials and data and spreadsheets that we have and figure out how we can better organize it and how to remove it and what do we keep and what do we delete, and just that zoom out is really what I need to do, so I'm really using so getting the landscape bigger questions and things.
And this was for me, the last time that I come in with virtually no knowledge, very little knowledge of working in libraries with their databases, but all the information is already set up. This is the first time where I've seen it from scratch. So I probably know the least of everyone prior. I presume that I know very little compared to others. So for me, it's just absorbing what all of this is and how does it play into CCP and then how can I, with this information, what can I do with my other skill sets?
Kevin?
Yeah, so my personal research right now is much more presentist, thinking around social media data and also protected communities or communities I need to protect, activist communities, with so much of that data already being structured for you. What is important to omit, considering that even if I just have the text of their tweets, I can probably find that person, reverse engineer up to a point, right? When we get to certainly older data, it gets a little more difficult, but I'm trying to figure out if I can ever even get to a point where I can make any of my data sets public. I don't think I can. Right now, the answer is no.
And so is your question then, how do I make that data useful?
Useful and useful to who?
And useful to who? If I can't make it public, what goes in the place of public if
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is most of the data that I have is public domain data, right? They're tweeting in public,
but still.
but I am concentrating those into, this black activist umbrella, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then, and I've already run into some issues where, people that have no business looking, having conversations with me about anything is looking to get access to my data set. So, part of the conversation I'm having is, around failure and when, as an academic, I just need to delete or trash or.
And I feel like one of the other questions that it is actually central to data curation, and data curation for Black research is like when you want to make sure that people can't get to stuff.
Correct.
How do you curate your data and where do you put it so that it is so it's not accessible.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, turning to, instead of the astronomers who are making it so everybody can get everything, thinking about people who work with health data. What are the ways that people who work with health data make sure that is protected? Because it's
Sure.
that level of protection, the kind of level of protection that your subjects need.
Yeah, correct. And now my work with CCP, the thing I'm most terrified of, that to the best of my knowledge hasn't happened yet, is you never know what the next, political hot button issue is that's related to history, and we are very well on one of those lines that all of a sudden blows up, and then data that, today is perfectly fine and safe to share and all of that, all of a sudden is connected to something else and becomes a political issue. So, how to account for things that are, unforeseen in that way, and put certain protections in or flexibilities where if we need to make a switch and all of a sudden this is now sensitive, that we can do that swiftly if need be.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to some of these questions of can you find data and where your data lives, and also having things like data dictionaries, right? Like making it really clear for people who want to know data exactly what your students need, and then also knowing all the places that your data is, so that if you're like, we need to use this for a second because we don't want what is happening to be happening, that you will know all the switches that you need to turn on, right? And that you will know how to turn off those switches without also like losing your data.
Correct.
There's a mic problem we're getting from Twitter.
Mic problem.
Yeah, those further away are harder to hear. I can't hear Lauren at all. It's pretty muffled. And
Gotcha.
there's 2 or 3 people who are saying that right
I
now.
got you. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
I mean, I think the question about what makes certain data curation black data curation to me is not that difficult. Like what makes art black, or what makes a black newspaper. I was just writing yesterday about what makes a black newspaper versus a white edited abolition paper. And for me, the big difference is the goals that are involved. That, you know, they might not do something wildly different in the way that you put a newspaper in the 19th century together, the way that we put data set together in terms of the kind of fundamental kind of practices, but then the objectives that get set for that, I think, really make a huge difference. And then I think the other part that we don't probably know yet, but that we're starting to actually, I think, hear in this conversation is that there are probably going to come to be, or maybe there already are, and we just haven't had a chance to talk about a lot of them. I think this is actually nice to hear out loud. Is that there are going to be certain kinds of practices about like thinking strategically about what access for different kinds of information is also happening in places like digital and Native American and indigenous studies. We're thinking a lot about these things, I think even more than we are. You know, there might be these just sort of standard kind of, I don't know what it's called, commonplaces maybe, where we say, like, okay, there's the world of data curation and working with data. Then we really want to talk about Black studies and data, or African American history and data. And we really have to sort of think through the different ways that people like folks here, people like Jessica Johnson's been writing about, right, which sort of talks about some of the databases. And I think at some point I would love to be able to read something that somebody could write. Starting to think through, I think, some of these issues, particularly around data, because it really does. I mean, it cuts both ways, really. I mean, to me, it oftentimes is such a sort of site of violence and abstraction and doing ugly things, but it also lets us share primary source records and oral histories that were never there, right? And so I feel like on a Tuesday I might have one answer, and on a Wednesday I might have a different answer for what I feel like the sort of politics of it are. Maybe there's a sort of deep-seated politics, maybe there's politics that are activated in the application of these different kinds of practices. Maybe it's somewhere in between. Maybe we're all just sort of complicit in late capitalism and we just sort of lose because that's the traffic of data. I don't know, but you know, I think it's worth thinking across projects more and more as we go. I think that's what I'm learning from this conversation.
So I have, as you might imagine, other slides that move through the process. At the end, I also have a series of questions that get to some of these questions. So my question now is, do we want to quickly just be like, boom, 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 these are the things that you might want to keep in mind, and then move to the discussion piece? Or do we just want to move to the discussion piece?
Let's see what, I mean, I'd like to see it. I don't want to speak for everybody.
For everybody.
Cat's law. There we go.
It's nice. We've got people from the live streaming responding to your comments. So.
The conversation.
So we should say hi to Denise Davison.
Shout out.
Hi, Darby.
Hi, Darby.
Anybody else?
Anybody else is here, we'll give them a shout out.
And Professor Davidson does some amazing work that people should check out about the history of Black women's groups. And she's part of the professional association and has done some amazing work about sort of working with students and people out in the world, sort of gathering all this information and making it legible in ways nobody has before.
Where can we find that, do you know?
That's a good question.
Let's,
I know that
Denise, Dr. Denise, why don't you tweet out where we can find your work that Jim is talking about now?
it's pretty cool. And it's so cool. I mean, one of the things that I love about sort of getting to know their projects is that she's also coming from the world of social work, where you think in somewhat different kinds of vocabularies, ways that I think are actually really productive to hear about. Even thinking about data curation and social work in the same world is, I think, a really productive.
I mean, this is one reason when I was hearing Shanna talk, and then I was thinking about our AME church initiatives, right, with transcribed records. I'm wondering if, are we, and I'm also thinking about where Black history is lodged and Black genealogies are lodged. I'm thinking, like, is the word we want to use, right, data dictionaries, or we want to talk about, like, data Bibles, right? Like, it's like, what in fact, and, and it might be dictionaries, right? Dictionaries have a, important place in African American, right, cultural history, too. But, where history is lodged is often in the family Bibles that get passed on and on, right? Like, so, like, how do we start thinking about a lexicon that is going to be familiar and comfortable and appropriate, right, and capture the nuances of Black community data curation, which gets back to your first question about what difference does it make? Or I guess I always put those words in front of any question, like, what difference does it make if we're talking about collective data curation, right, rather than institutional or research management? That's what sort of collective management rather than research or institutional management. Anyway.
I think that an interesting piece of this, like, name conventions is so, with lots of data that has been put online, people use what's called a README file. And so, like lots of times you'll hear people talk about, like, making a README. And the first time I taught data curation to humanists, I was like, oh, a README. But that doesn't mean anything to humanists at all. Which is basically it is the exact same thing as a data dictionary. So now in digital humanities, lots of people talk about a data dictionary because it's a term that humanist researchers could be like, oh, I know what this is. So the notion of naming it yet again for a different community, I think, makes lots of sense. Like, the goal is that you have explanatory material, and, like, how do we let people know that this is where the explanatory material is? And that no matter what you call it, that it needs to have the same kinds of pieces, which is like, what is the thing you're about to pick up? What are the parts of it? How are those parts connected? What might you do with those pieces? So the next stage after, just as a quick reminder, after processing, is generally analysis. And I think the most important part here is that when we think about data curation, the goal is really that you, as the people who are making and managing the data, that you will have one data set. Even if your one data set has lots and lots of pieces, you will have one data set, and then you will use many tools to analyze it, right? That it won't matter whether you are using Cytoscape or whether you are using some other tool that won't be invented for 16 more years. That you will be able to use a bunch of different kinds of tools on one data set. And I think that often when we talk about analysis, we think about, like, oh, how are people going to visualize this? But I know that y'all have also been interested in search. And so thinking about how do you have one data set and which tools for searching this data set do you actually want to have available to you? There's a product called, like, Elasticsearch. Question is Elasticsearch the right thing? And in terms of data curation, that question and your data set should not, your data set should determine the answer to the question. You shouldn't be shaping your data set around the tools that you are adopting. You might need to sometimes, like, stooge the data that you're moving through those tools, right, to make them, like, fit whatever systems you have agreed to be a part of, but that you shouldn't actually fundamentally change your data set because a tool asks you. Preserving, we talked some about this, which is that for the long term,
formats that are not proprietary, which I actually do think, like thinking about like what it would mean to think about data curation in Black research, like that using non-proprietary formats and formats that will stand the test of time, like is actually really important. And I think it's especially important because often, because I think that there are two issues here that might be important. And one of them is that when we use things that are just freely available because a developer has made them, sometimes we end up contorting our stuff into formats that are actually not going to be durable in the future, but they are available, and so that we become like part of the whim of the larger environments that we're in, and that if we can find a way to make it so that data can be moved from one place to another over time, it is a way to actually have these stories and have this data have a kind of durability that matters. And then thinking about storage, I was thinking about Kevin's data and how one of the things that people don't do with health data is that they don't, I mean, when they actually care about people getting it or not getting it, they don't store it in random places in the cloud, right? And so that there might be data that you're like, this data should be on a drive. I will have a backup for it, but I actually don't want it in a world that can be hacked. Because hacking a hard drive at your house is a lot harder than hacking something on the cloud, right? Like someone can, in theory, bust into your house and get it, but the odds of that are much lower.
How do you feel about like those personal clouds, like the what is it, the Western Digital personal clouds, those kind of things? Do you?
Like a VN.
No, I mean that you can buy a cloud drive, right? It's physical drive, but
like a piece from AWS.
Yeah.
So I think that there are two ways to think about that. So on the one hand, like Amazon, for the durability and long-term life of them as a company, they probably do need to have good security. You would want to read a lot about it. At the same time, like that will be more accessible, right? Like there is a way for that to be reached in a way that like things that you have on devices that you own that are non-clouded aren't reachable. I think there is a question though, right? Like there are questions about cost though, and questions about transfer over time and like your ability to share that data with other people. And so all of these things are trade-offs. And I think it really does depend on like how important is it to you that people can't actually get into this. One of the things when I was looking around at some of the different, maybe it's further down, some of the different kinds of applications that I thought y'all might end up using, or some of the different services that I thought y'all might end up using. For almost all of their Wikipedia pages, there's a section that's like breaches, and like lets you know, like, like when has this particular product had all its data breached, which is like a very
Wow.
Also, thanks Wikipedia.
Interesting Wikipedia article.
But also thinking about security, I know in the digital world we think around like the hostility or the threat being a digital threat, but like I'm still terrified that like police will raid something that I'm connected to, right? Like, you know what I mean? So
Well, there's a whole sort of community of people who are thinking about those kind of issues too, right? About like
in digital with things that we label as digital.
Yeah, I mean, I think the non-academic world would be folks like say you're an LGBT activist in a country where like there's all kinds of awful laws on the books, right? Like you might have all kinds of digital communications, but you have to have a really robust set of kind of defense things,
Mhm.
right? It was very, I mean, I remember learning about this first when the woman who made the Edward Snowden documentary
Mhm.
wrote a long kind of personal essay where she actually wound up having to do things
Mhm.
like she would never travel with a laptop. She would never travel with a hard drive.
Mhm.
She
Mhm.
would bring only a notebook sometimes, and not even that,
Mhm.
and would send her data actually physically to people in like fourth-party locations
Mhm.
in order to be able to dodge state censors, because they knew that if she was going to an international airport, which she had to do the work, that she was going to spend like a day and a half sitting in a cell somewhere being interrogated by customs people.
Mhm.
And so people even sort of, I think, started to develop, and I think it's always a kind of moving target. I mean, there's like police who might come and look at things on the local side, but then like
I was looking at you.
security forces come and are going to look at things, and at some point, like, people talk about things like air gapping, right? Or, like, never having a device connect to the internet and all these kind of things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those, I think, are the deep end versions of these questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
Disconnected.
that some of the question is like how, if something like that happened, what would be the most important thing to protect, and then like how do you think you can protect it? So like if police came and took
Mhm.
your hard drives,
Mhm.
like is there an encryption that you can add that that isn't that complicated, that at least for local police forces would
Mhm.
be like
Yeah.
not worth their time, right? Like
Yeah.
Or should there be regular practices of deleting data?
yeah. I think
Right? I mean, that's the other
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
Just because you collect the data in 2007 doesn't mean maybe you should have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find myself quite at odds with that a lot, where it's like, I probably need to delete this, but I might use it for another project one day. I'm not, right? But
Yeah. So the last part of this is about getting access and reusing things. So if you want to give people access to the data itself, which the data itself in a way that is manipulable, right? Which is different than giving people access to see the data, which I think is an interesting piece of your data set. Is that like part of the power of it, right? Is that people will be able to like read it. That people will be able to scroll through it or click through it. And so these spaces, like data repositories, would actually be a terrible fit for that. Like no one, like they're not easy ways to view data. They're not friendly for anyone who isn't like planning to use this data in kind of a robust way, and instead like publishing the content of the data with analysis would be the thing that would like really make a meaningful intervention, right? Sorry. Just in general though, when we say data repositories, these are really places to put the data itself that probably is only friendly to a group of people who like want to use this data for their own analysis and will be able to like figure out what to do with it. So data repositories are really like for other scholars or people who have like a kind of scholarly interest. Access to online data stores, I think, is another interesting thing. So we talked some about Airtable, which is one way that you can like put up your data, though it's proprietary, and we'll get back to that. GitHub, you can also put up your data, but in the same way that these data repositories allow you to put your data in a published fixed form somewhere so that someone else can use it. They also like, they're not about right? Like they're not about interacting with it. They're not about a kind of curated engagement with the data. They're really about making sure that the data has like a long and preserved life, or is used by other people, like in the field is often the kind of discourse.
And then this last thing, which I feel like we're going to continue to get at, which is whether you're interested in open sharing or gated sharing or collaboration. And collaboration here being like people helping you make the data, as opposed to gated sharing is like other people can use our data. We just want to know who they are. Or open sharing where you're like, just take it.
Dr. Davison has a question too about a different kind of sharing, which is between institutions, and about, I think this is a question we can certainly speak to too, platforms and that you might use if you want to ensure that you can move from one university to another.
Yes. So the 3 platforms, if you wanted to move from one university to another and like continue to have this data that you can get back to and also like share it with other people, is Zenodo is university is agnostic. It's just a place for scholars to put up material. It's European based. And you can just upload your data. The problem is that both Zenodo and OSF make your data public. So the idea is with those you would want to publicly share it. If you want to be able to move your data privately and you don't just want to have it, carried with you, GitHub is a really good option because it's really easy to make things private, to gate things in GitHub.
Do you also want to talk about server questions in terms of institutional shifts?
Go ahead.
No?
We all know this.
There's the question of whether or not you want to be in your own institution's repository and server, or if you want to go to reclaim hosting or something that allows you to move more easily. But there are people in the room who know more about this than I do. That's the short version.
Yeah, that's the short version. And the short version really is that, like, if you are choosing an institutional repository, or like your institution is propping up your version of whatever,
like Becca, the questions to ask before you get started are, can I grab all my data down? And also, the things that I can't grab down, are they an important piece of this project as well? Right? Because you might be able to get all of your data out of a Mecca, but you're still going to be leaving behind an interface and a way of engaging that you might have been really invested in.
And if you're gone, it's going to decay, right? Like at some point, if you're not there anymore and someone else doesn't adopt it, someone at the library or the School of Arts and Sciences is going to sunset it.
So, since we have Stuart in the room, Bill Andrews is retiring this year, retired last year, something like that. You've been away from UNC, and Documenting the American South has gone through a major upgrade, right? Or is it just on its same thing for years and years and years?
But we use it
all. Everyone uses it all. No, everyone, not such a huge word.
So many
of us find it very valuable and important. How did they manage that besides its simplicity?
Documenting the American South is really thought of as a library project. So it was
always
great
a library project.
Yeah, so it was great that Dr. Andrews was there and really helped build the project, but the library really did take responsibility for it. Assuming UNC continues, and it's definitely a very challenged institution.
So what do people need to put into place with libraries to make sure that their projects can enjoy some longevity and not be degraded once the principal parties who were involved have moved on to other places and are doing other things or have retired? Like, what are some best practices you can share with folks?
Denise, I hope this is
a logical extension of Dr. Denise. I hope that this is a logical extension of your question.
Oh gosh.
It's a complicated question.
It is a complicated question, but it's, I think, how much work are you doing, right? And if the communities become dependent on what you've shared, and then you don't keep your eye on the ball of where it was, right, where it's uploaded, depending on what you build, right? I mean, it could be just data sets that you share with folks, right? Like that could go with you. But if you figure out some other kind of mode, then these questions become important because communities start to depend on work. And
So how do we?
how do we think about these kind of best practices?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like part of the tension is that almost when institutions are willing to take on hosting projects like these, they almost always come with agreements that are temporal in nature and sometimes involve a moment where you get to like say, please re-up this. Like at least at Penn, and I think at Emory as well, that was how it worked. That there's an idea that like after 3 years, someone's going to send you an email and be like, should we keep this going or should we sunset it? Which is like a fair use of institutional resources. And so I think that one of the questions would be, like, if there is a way, if that is part of the agreement in your institution, is there a way when you're leaving to make sure that you go to the people in the library, or so that, I mean, libraries don't know what faculty are leaving. Like there isn't a moment where we're told who is going. In the same way that we aren't told about new hires, right? like things librarians wish they knew that no institution will ever share. But I think that if you're moving from one place to another, like at that moment, going to the institutional group, whether it's a library or an IT department, and being like, this is where you will contact me in a year and a half when I know this is going to come up to be re-upped. And like at that point, in general, if you can say there's a community of people who are looking at this, who like care about it, I do feel like most institutions are like, yeah, we want to maintain that.
Right, and I would, generally speaking, that is the role of a library historically, to take care of these things once the individuals behind them are no longer involved. I think maybe more specifically in our context, whoever does special collections and archives would be the person to talk to, or a person in those spaces would probably be able to handle that. I would also, every library conference I've been to since I've been a librarian, the idea of digital preservation has been a huge topic. But the fact that like no one really knows what to do with digital information, how is this going to behave in 100 years? Right. We don't have. Yeah. So but it's something that people are thinking about. Thinking about documenting the American South. One of the reasons that it is still available is it is extraordinarily simple.
That's why I say it's really static. It's simple. It's
right. And I've often had the conversation of, and the humanist in me doesn't like to do this act of decoupling, but if you can think about a project in terms of the data behind it and the presentation layer, and then think, is it possible to preserve the data and then the presentation layer can evolve? The presentation layer is often part of the argument, so that you can't so neatly pull that apart. But that is sort of one mental exercise you can have.
This seems to me to be particularly important because so many libraries don't have people in it who understand the importance of the work that we're doing. And so if you're in a place that doesn't have a special collection or anybody in the decision-making tree that actually understands or values the communities of use, right? Even if you've documented them. So best practices is obviously like figure out and document who's using it in ways that are metrics that matter. But and that's not easy to do. Like I take snapshots of of Twitter. I don't know that I ever get, like when somebody says, we just manipulated your data for our final, right, et cetera, et cetera. We had a conversation, that was today, right? We had a conversation about your data practices, and data is justice on our final.
Thank you, whoever you were.
Right, for doing
But then
that.
how we get
But
that
then
into
how
the
we get
yearly
that into the
report,
yearly report, right?
It's something different.
It's something different. I think that grants can be a really, really useful way to make sure that this happens, because they're data preservation agreements in almost all major grants. And so that's the moment where libraries actually have to go from that 3-year to that 10-year, or 15-year, or 30-year. And so and I think that NEH Office of Digital Humanities is particularly good at playing a role as an advocate for our work.
And so
those people, those wonderful program officers and amazing advocates for the work that we do are really good, not at just giving money, but at giving guidance, right, about how to negotiate with libraries. And that's the moment where you can say, because
our institutions
are so happy to get humanists into the habit of getting grants, that even if you're bringing in like a DH level 1 grant, like a very, $35,000, $50,000, they'll agree to stuff they wouldn't agree to just, with you going to them. And then I've made it a habit of becoming an affiliate of the library itself, right? So I'm a senior fellow at my present institution. I just got affiliate status as faculty at the other at my new institution, because that signals to the library, like, I want to be in conversation with you. I'm a part of your community. And I frankly am much more dependent. Our work is much more dependent on our relationships with libraries and librarians and the various and multiple capacities that they bring to a project like ours than I am to get it to the communities that we want to get it to, than my faculty colleagues can help me with. So thinking through some of those issues.
I also want to just put it on Twitter, but I think the common misunderstanding is that sustainability is something that happens in the design of a project. And I don't know this, but I would be willing to bet a lot of money that somebody is helping to maintain DocSouth in the libraries. And I put a link onto the. There was a group at Pitt that made the socio-technical sustainability roadmap, which is a real mouthful. And they have this kind of. They did a bunch of kind of studying of what works and what doesn't work. They did a lot of kind of really careful analysis. And the major finding that they found was that you basically have to plan in 3-year cycles. And you have to plan to revisit all of the kind of fundamental questions every 3 years. With the idea that and I heard him give a presentation on this over the summer. One of the things that determines whether or not a project is sustainable versus unsustainable is whether or not people are actually using it. And I think you sort of alluded to this too, is that even the smartest, most well-designed, future-proof project that doesn't get used won't get maintained, so it won't last. And so it's a social question more than a technical one. Or it's a mixed one.
I love when you put things like that. It's a social question rather than a technical. I'm sorry.
And I think that another piece of that is what Stuart was getting to. So like even in like data management through grants, where like one of the things that you'll get is that people will agree to like post things for much longer. What they're agreeing to preserve and host often is really the underlying data and an emulation of what you have, right? Like the notion that people would be able to say that in 10 years someone's going to be able to use a site as it is just like technically impossible. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons that curating your data then becomes so important, to make sure that when you are putting things into beautiful, community appropriate interfaces, that you know, like, what are the things about those interfaces that you have to continue to have, and what of that is actually embedded in the data, and then what of that has to become part of the apparatus that you put around the data, right? So things like a data dictionary, things that describe, like, this is the reason that we have this, so that when someone's like, man, we thought it was going to be UNC, but it turns out George Mason tanked, and there is no Omeka. Like, what are the features that were super important about this interaction? Which again, as you were saying, aren't technical, like they're really social questions. Like, what is this thing doing?
Do a time check.
Yeah, should we take a tiny break?
We've got people online.
Okay.
But maybe they want to get up.
Maybe they want to get up and get a coffee. I don't know. Oh, we're talking about a short break?
Must see TV.
I guess also I probably have like 4 slides left, so we could just go through them. They're literally just questions. So one of them is, do you want to publish data or analysis? If you want others to use your data, who and why? If you want to build data collaboratively, how will you decide who has access to which pieces of the process?
Well, and that's an interesting you there. I mean, that assumes that you have the power to decide who has access to what piece of the process.
Yes.
Right, depending on where your project is housed and what their security
Yeah.
apparatus looks like.
And then also, and then, because the technical solution follows the social one, how will you give people access to a piece of the process? So the first part is really a social question about like, who do you want to be here? And then the second part is like, if you've decided that, where do you need to put things and in what ways so that you can actually achieve that? What is your strategy for the future? When things change platforms, how often do you want to have to change platforms, and how much money do you want to spend? So this is an email to me that I got last month that's saying like, Table Fusion tables, you best take care of this because we are.
That broke my heart. That broke my heart.
That broke a lot of people's hearts.
It broke a lot of people's
And it broke a lot with me.
Yeah, and then Miriam Posner, when I was thinking about Airtable, I found this tweet from her where she's like kind of bummed that Airtable apparently got a big infusion of venture capital money, counting down to its acquisition in 3, 2, 1, and already there are all sorts of pieces of functionality that used to be free about it that you have to pay for. That are, I think, yeah, like these questions about, is there a way to make a flatter, simpler version of your data that you can port from place to place? And then if you're making your data in things, how do you have a plan to like regularly take it out?
We really need for somebody to build a Airtable, but more like Omeka in cultural heritage space. If anybody has a developer shop and like, I think that's the major missing piece.
What you're saying is Center for History and New Media. The next thing we need is an Airtable. Or Awesome Tables is like another.
Right. I mean, you could probably bend Omeka a little bit to do these sort of things if you really wanted to contort things, but it does seem to me like this is one of the major kind of missing pieces, is the spreadsheet to relational database gap is very large and relatively sparse.
So I felt like for a while Stanford was doing some interesting making of data tools. So they had Palladio and they had, what is it called, like Brevity?
Breve?
Breve, yeah.
Yeah.
And they haven't done something like that. Also, I don't know if any of those things are still
I think everybody left.
built. And in some ways, I think this is such an interesting story about digital humanities, where like people were making tools and then they were like, oh man, this is like a terrible idea. Let's all make data instead. and now the problem is that then you have to like find the proprietary systems that you're willing to be a part of. And I guess that was, is that the last? doesn't matter which company or institution has your data. And like, I think especially thinking on both ends, thinking about what it means for the continued life of your data, but also thinking about like, Google will help you make everything possible. I'm using Google Slides right now. Do I want to feed the beast? I was also looking at Airtable, and they have like all of the humans, and you can like find out who they got venture capital from, right? And so the question is like, are they doing things in ways where I'm like, yeah, this is the world I want to build. That I think is tough. So we are at 1:03, as you said.
Break for food, and then we'll come back, and I know you want to be very attentive to time.
Well, I just want to ask people in the room what their time is like. I think we have a lot to want to question each other about, but I also want to be mindful of people's time for today, and if we want to just tie it up here or take a break and come back till 1:30.
Breaks are always good because then people can leave if they need to.
So why don't we take a 5-10 minute break and then come back for a final 10-15 break?
Yeah.
Wrap up.
Yep.
Right.
That sounds
Yeah,
good.
good. Close it for the live stream.
We just want folks to
Continue to be interactive in the way they have, and thank you for coming today. And any suggestions you have on questions that you want to pose, workshop directions that you want to see, just tweet at us at CCP and at DigBlack, hit the hashtag DigBlack, and we'd be happy to incorporate those questions and directions. So thank you guys for coming, and we loved having you here with us. Bye.